everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Good evening, it's Mark Dolan in for Mark Steyn tonight and tomorrow night, and we bring you full reaction to the announcement of the final two in the race to be our next Prime Minister. It's Liz Truss versus Rishi Sunak. Are either of them really an improvement on Boris Johnson? Which of these two can rescue our economy and perhaps more importantly, keep Sir Keir Starmer and his coalition of chaos out of number 10? I'll be speaking to a bunch of Tory MPs, all of whom have skin in the game. We'll be speaking to Truss backers and Sunak supporters, including Dr. Liam Fox in just a moment. So who do they think should get the top job? Should Sunak hold fire on heading to John Lewis to get those curtains measured for number 10? And is it Liz Truss's time? Also on tonight's show, did Britain overreact to the heatwave? Have 2 good days of weather been leveraged by eco-fanatics to change our way of life and wreck the economy? Or was the mini heatwave copper-bottomed evidence that the planet is heating up? We'll speak to Jamie Jenkins, former statistician at the ONS, who's crunched the numbers about just how bad the heatwave actually was. Plus, we're going to speak to The Spectator's Alexandra Marshall, live from Down Under, where she thinks her government have been drinking the climate Kool-Aid as they sign up to host the COP29 summit in 2024. Plus, reaction to Boris Johnson's last ever PMQs, with hypocritical MPs cheering him days after they plunged the knife. Politics, eh? And I'll be answering your questions at the end of the show in Stump the Steyn. Tonight's your chance to drill Dolan. Ask me anything. And I won't be seeing your emails in advance. The email for the show is gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet me at gbnews. A very busy one tonight. My main challenge is to ascertain who is actually going to be your next Prime Minister. But let's start with the headlines, and here's Polly Middlehurst.
Mark, thank you. The top story, of course, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss are the ones now to battle it out to become the next leader of the Conservative Party and ultimately the Prime Minister. Tory members have until the 5th of September to decide who will replace Boris Johnson. Penny Mordaunt was knocked out of the leadership race after scoring the fewest votes out of the 3. Mr Sunak believes he's the only person who can win the next general election.
This leadership contest has shown that we've got fantastically able people at the top of our party. All of them bring something exceptional to the table. But at this point, the question for our members is, who is the best possible person to beat Keir Starmer in the next election? And it's clear that I'm the only candidate who can do that.
Well, the former Foreign Secretary Liz Truss says she's delighted by the result.
What's important is that we hit the ground running. We've got 2 years until a likely next general election, and I want to deliver for people. I want to deliver lower taxes. I want to help struggling families. I want to make sure that we unleash all the potential and talent across Britain. And that has been my focus throughout this campaign, and that's what I'm going to be campaigning on over the next 6 weeks.
Well, in news away from politics, a retired pig farmer has been sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term to serve of 18 years for murdering his wife 4 decades ago. The remains of David Venable's wife were found 3 years ago in a septic tank on a farm they once owned in Worcestershire. The 89-year-old reported Brenda Venables missing after killing her in 1982. The prosecution said he'd wanted to resume his long-standing affair with another woman. Ukraine's First Lady has appealed to the United States for more defence systems to help them defeat Russia. Ola Zelenska urged US Congress to provide more air support in the fight against President Putin, now in its 5th month, saying weapons could help assure victory. The US has donated over £6.5 billion in security assistance since the war began. The wife of the Ukrainian president, who received a standing ovation, asked how many times families would be destroyed by the war.
The war is not over. The terror continues. And I appeal to all of you on behalf of those who were killed, on behalf of the people who lost their arms and legs, and those who wait for their families to come back from the front. I'm asking for weapons. Weapons that won't be used to wage a war on somebody else's land, but to protect one's home and the right to wake up alive in that home.
Here, London's fire brigade has said yesterday was the busiest day for the service since World War II. It said they received more than 2,500 calls and responded to more than 1,000 incidents. That's after large blazes swept through parts of England amid record-breaking temperatures of over 40 degrees. And major incidents were declared by fire brigades in at least 6 regions across the UK. That's it. You're up to date on TV, online and on your radio via DAB+. This is GB News, where now it's time for Mark Steyn with Mark Dolan.
Two's company, 3 was a crowd, and now it's Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak who slug it out for the biggest prize in public life, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Sunak and Truss are the last 2 housemates in this reality soap opera. We watch as they fight it out over who's the most Brexiteer, the most economically competent and the most conservative. Yes, conservative prime ministers that were actually conservative. Remember them? Very hard to come by these days. When Sir Graham Brady announced the final 2 at 4 p.m. today, just the right side of my afternoon nap, I have to admit that I breathed a sigh of relief. It meant that the ultra-woke eco-activist, pronoun-obsessed Penny Mordaunt, a woman who couldn't even bring herself to use the expression pregnant woman when drafting legislation in the House of Commons, is no more. She, her, they, them, whatever, has been sent packing. And your sisters, your mothers and your daughters can breathe a sigh of relief too. We won't have a vagina denier in number 10. And someone that, according to Lord Frost, goes AWOL more often than Lord Lucan. Now, I'm well aware that my preferred choice of Rishi Sunak is currently about as popular as a split condom in a brothel. The vast majority of you emailing my show are just not having this young banker. And the Grassroots polling looks challenging for the big man. Well, the little man. They see him, Sunak, as a globalist, a corporate figure pushing for digital currencies and a cashless society. They see him as an out-of-touch, eye-wateringly rich man, not committed to living in this country, who turns up to a building site in Teesside wearing 400 quid loafers. Loafers? They're not even comfortable. What was he thinking? They always slip off at the back. Plus, a majority see Sunak as the guy that stabbed Boris in the front and wrote the cheques for the disastrous, failed experiment of lockdowns. But all of that, don't forget, was at Boris's request. He was the boss, Collective cabinet responsibility means they all own this debacle of a poorer, angrier, sicker and more divided country. Even Liz Truss remained in post as Foreign Secretary, sat around that cabinet table as the madness of lockdowns ensued. Which takes me to the odds-on favourite, the blonde bombshell herself, Margaret Thatcher Mark II, or so she hopes. The good news is Liz Truss is highly experienced. With 5 cabinet positions to her name, she's had some of the biggest jobs in government, including environment, justice, and as Foreign Secretary, she stood up to Putin following his invasion of Ukraine. Plus, she was the queen of the trade deal and very much the face of global Britain whilst Trade Secretary. I think she'd be a very capable Prime Minister. She's not woke, she's hardworking, and she's got an eye for detail. In Liz, I'm willing to trust. But those on the Tory right who are backing her so wholeheartedly should be careful what they wish for. By sacrificing backstabbing Rishi, as they see it, for loyal Liz Truss, they'll be backing a second Remain Prime Minister in 5 years. And you saw how that worked out last time. Is Brexit really in her bones? You tell me. And Liz is a true Conservative, given that she was previously a Lib Dem. How does that work? Here she is campaigning as a youngster for the Lib Dems. She loves a U-turn, doesn't she? Plus, I think we can agree that she's no Margaret Thatcher at the dispatch box. And during those TV debates, she was wobbly at best. Not because she's not bright or doesn't know her stuff, but she just isn't a great performer. And this takes me to my point. What is the real hope, the real ambition of those voting in this leadership contest? Is it to have a leader that they like? Someone who allies themselves with what they want to hear? Are they looking for a leader who they want to have a pint with? Or one who is a down-to-earth person? A man or woman of the people? Why? Why does that matter? Mark my words, all of that is a sideshow. You're only looking for one thing between now and September, the individual who can win the next election. The person who can keep the cervix-free leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, out of number 10. That's not just in the Conservative Party's interest, it's in the national interest too, in my opinion. Imagine 5 years of Prime Minister Starmer and a Britain-hating, lockdown-loving, mask and vaccine mandating, woke Britain-hating coalition of Labour, the SNP and the Lib Dems. Welcome to hell. Obsessing over Rishi Sunak's expensive loafers is just pathetic identity politics, where you have to be poor to understand the plight of the poor. Bollocks. Most MPs are deeply privileged people. None of them are really in touch with what ordinary people are going through. And it's my view the great people of this country would happily be led by a trillionaire as long as they have the right policies to improve their lives. Americans struggling financially didn't care about Donald Trump's wealth when they voted for change in 2016. Love him or hate him, old Sunak knows the Treasury inside out. He's a self-made millionaire who understands money. And for the next 2 years, getting the economy right is the only show in town. And he's a much better, more polished performer than his opponent. He nailed those TV debates. Remember when we last had a terrible performer in number 10, Theresa May? Be afraid. Be very afraid. Oh, and Sunak's a Brexiteer too, campaigning against Britain's membership of the European Union since, wait for it, his school days. If it's about winning the election, properly fulfilling the potential of Brexit and fixing our economy, Rishi might not be the popular choice, but he's the right one. There's no point having a leader you love who sat on the wrong side of those green benches. Let's get reaction to the final two in the race for number 10. Let's speak to Conservative MP, arch Brexiteer, former Defence Secretary, Dr. Liam Fox. Dr. Fox, welcome to GB News.
Good evening.
Dr. Fox, are Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak the best the Conservative Party have to offer the country?
Well, these are the two candidates selected by the parliamentary party who know my colleagues best. I think you made the point very clearly there that what we're talking about, this is not being in opposition, where we're looking to see who might be Prime Minister in 5 years. This is who'll be Prime Minister in 7 weeks. And for me, that was very much about choosing the person that I believed would be over the detail of government, believed in the same things that I believe, obviously, when you're casting your vote, that would be able to bring the best team to government and would bring the greatest competence to government. Because ultimately, as I think you very correctly said, this is not about the Conservative Party, although this is our vote. It's ultimately about the country and who's best to lead the country through a very difficult period, not just at home, but also abroad.
Why is Rishi Sunak polling so badly among the grassroots? Why do I get so many emails to my programme here on GB News saying anyone but Rishi?
Well, I get people in my own constituency who split in several ways over the campaign. I think they have very much warmed to Rishi as the campaign's gone on, and we'll see how it goes in the country. They now have a clear choice. I hope that the respective campaigns focus on the merits of their own candidates, and we don't get this sort of blue-on-blue entertainment for the media, but bad for the country. And I think that for me, when I sit down to, as many leadership campaigns I've now witnessed, I tend to sit down and write down the things that I believe in and then see who the candidates are that are closest to that. And I want Brexit to be successful, so I'm looking for a Brexiteer. I think that we need to have sound money in our country, and therefore I need someone who's a fiscal conservative. I need to have someone who's competent and top of all the detail, not just in economics, but across foreign policy and security and environmental and other policies too. And for me, we also need to have the person who is most likely to win an election. I mean, you mentioned there about a potential coalition between Labour and the SNP. I mean, I grew up as a Conservative and Unionist. It matters hugely to me that we can hold our country together, and the thought of Labour being in hock to a separatist SNP, you described it as hell. I mean, I'm not sure in a programme like this I can actually describe what I think about that, but you can imagine that it's worse than your own description.
I can read between the lines. However, we hear that Rishi Sunak has been preparing his leadership bid for months now in the midst of an economic crisis. The bottom line for many of my viewers is that Rishi Sunak is too slick, too rich and too disloyal to be Prime Minister.
Well, I find this a really weird thing that if you're rich, you can't really be leader of the country. You can't be leader of the Conservative Party. Here's someone whose parents were a GP and a chemist, who actually worked hard, got a scholarship through his own efforts, and as you say, became a self-made wealthy man. I thought that was the story of conservatism. I thought that's what we wanted to see, that we wanted to see people from ordinary beginnings being able to be given the chance to create wealth. And it rather bothers me, this sort of, we don't want to see rich people doing well in our country, because if we can't get wealth creation, how are we going to pay for the public services that we want? How do we pay for the tax cuts that we all want to see if we can't get that wealth creation? Rather than concentrating on how we distribute money, how we spend money, how about actually debating how we create money and create wealth in our country? It seems to me that that's the key debate as we go into the next 6 weeks. And my own view is that Rishi Sunak is way ahead in terms of his ideas of how we do that.
You've been one of the most high-profile proponents of Brexit for a very, very long time, one of the founding fathers of Brexit, if you like, Dr. Fox. Why do the right of the party and Brexiteers like Nadine Dorries and Jacob Rees-Mogg have it in for Rishi Sunak?
Well, you'd have to ask them about that. I find it rather strange that those who campaigned for Brexit seem to be willing to not support the long-standing Brexiteer candidate, but that's entirely up to them. I think he's got the consistency of belief. And you know, when he was a young MP and he was being pressured by David Cameron's team at the time, said, you know, if you campaign for Brexit, you'll have no career in the Conservative Party. He could easily have folded, as many did, and said, well, I'll do what's good for my career and I'll be a Remainer, whether I believe that or not. And he didn't do that. He said, no, I'm sorry, this is what I really believe in. I'm going to campaign for it, even if in the short term that's against my interest. Now, that, to me, is what real leadership is about. You stick to what you believe. If it's unpopular, fine. And you know, when we get to the economic arguments, Mrs. Thatcher used to say, if you want to be popular, my dear, go into light entertainment. Politics is entirely the wrong career. And we do need politicians who are willing to tell things as they are. And as they say, if things coming from politicians sound too good to be true, It's probably because they're too good to be true, and economically we need to get back to sound public finances. And in all the debates that we saw, where I thought Rishi Sunak was by far the best performer, the one soundbite that really struck home to me was when he said, if the Conservative Party is not about sound money, what is it for? And I think we do need to get back to some of the reality of that debate, not promising things that we can't deliver, recognising that inflation has got to be dealt with first. And then if we've got sound public finances, as Mrs. Thatcher would have said, tax cuts are something which are earned. They're not there by right.
Well, of course, in regards to Mrs. Thatcher, what you saw was what you got, Liam Fox. But is Rishi Sunak really all he appears to be? Because you call him a Brexiteer, and I mentioned in my monologue that he campaigned against our membership of the European Union back in his school days. And of course, he voted Brexit in 2016, unlike his opponent Truss. But it's rumoured in Whitehall that he's been pushing back on unleashing the true potential of global Britain as Chancellor, pushing back on cutting away red tape and properly standing up to the EU. And also, you called him sort of, this sensible fiscal money man. You called him a conservative, but it's not very conservative to run a national debt that's beyond £2 trillion, a deficit in terms of day-to-day spending, and of course, the outrageous impact of COVID measures, the lockdowns, and the impact on the economy. Highest taxes since the Second World War. Not very conservative by the sounds of it.
Well, of course, if Rishi Sunak hadn't been the Chancellor who, with quick thinking, brought in the furlough scheme, who knows where our economy would be today? We'd almost certainly have much higher unemployment than we have, at a huge cost to the taxpayer. We'd obviously have far fewer viable businesses than we have today. And I was one of those who said that the Bank of England carried on the quantitative easing for too long, but I have no doubt that the furlough measures that Rishi Sunak brought forward were the correct ones to have. Now, the question is, do you actually think that having spent that money, we've got to recoup it and get back to financial sanity again? Well, I think, yes, we do, and that's not going to be an easy period for us, but we have to get balance of our books much greater than we have, because borrowing money to spend or borrowing money for tax cuts is simply deferred taxation onto the next generation, and I don't find that either economically or morally very acceptable.
Fox, a couple of quick ones before we let you go. Thank you so much for your time. Will Prime Minister Rishi Sunak be tough in relation to the EU and the Northern Ireland Protocol? Will he risk global ignominy by tearing up that protocol if he has to?
Well, tonight we all voted for that. We've just gone through in Parliament the third reading for that. The Conservative Party was very solid about that. We know that we need to ensure that all the citizens of the United Kingdom are the same. And I think there are lots of ways of dealing with this issue. The trade issue, as you know, I was Trade Secretary. The trade issue could be settled by a number of principles, not least those set out by David Trimble, the architect of the Good Friday Agreement, who said that by mutual enforcement we could deal with this. And by that, for those who don't understand that, it means that in the United Kingdom we would pass fairly tough laws that said it would be illegal to export things into the European Union through Ireland that were in breach of EU rules of origin or EU standards, and there would be reciprocal legislation on the other side. That deals with the legal trade issue, and it would be fine at the World Trade Organization and keep us within our international obligations. At that point we could say to the European Union, we've dealt with your worries about trade, what else is all this about? Because I think it's the trade is a small part, but it actually hides a lot of European ambitions, not least to keep Northern Ireland inside European law, just in case you get a Prime Minister who doesn't fancy being outside the European Union. That would be, of course, not only a tragedy, but a betrayal of the British people. OK, two quick ones before we get a word on Boris. We've got to get real about this, Liam Fox. As it stands, Rishi Sunak loses this contest, this face-off with Liz Truss, according to the polling. So what has he got to do in terms of his strategy, in terms of his public profile, to win over the Tory grassroots? He's got the Tory MPs in his back pocket, but how does he win over the country? Well, I think that point is very important because MPs know their colleagues best, and the fact that he won a very healthy win amongst the MPs, they know the qualities of the candidates and they've seen them up close in a way that the party members have not. I think he's got to get the message across to the party that if we want to be serious as Conservatives, then we've got to get our public finances back under control. We had to take measures during the pandemic that none of us, frankly, would have wanted to have to take. But if we want to get long-term stability and we want to have lower taxes, that means a smaller state, and it means consolidating those public finances in a way that we used to take for granted. It means saying things that people don't necessarily want to hear. It's not a great thing that politicians want to hear, but I've been very impressed by his willingness to do so.
OK, and I'll let you have a pop at the opposition. Liz Truss, why does she not enjoy your support?
I'm not going to talk about opposition or the other candidates at all during this campaign. I think that is only grist to the mill for the Labour Party. I think we should talk about the merits, the qualities of our own candidates. The other side can do the same. I'm not getting on to blue-on-blue attacks. I think that's just what the SNP Labour coalition would love us to do, and I'm not going to give them the joy of that.
And Liam Fox, the Prime Minister, signed off in style in his final PMQs. Take a look at this.
I want to thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank all the wonderful staff of the House of Commons. I want to thank all my friends and colleagues. I want to thank my rival friend opposite, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank everybody here, and hasta la vista, baby. Thank
you. Liam Fox, what's Boris Johnson's legacy, and was it a mistake to get rid of him?
Well, the strengths that Boris had were as a campaigner. He got us an 80-seat majority at the last election, and we've got mostly Brexit done, with the exception of the Northern Ireland protocol. And I think he gave the country a sense of confidence, not least through his vaccine programme during the pandemic. All of those were the pluses. The minuses were, I think, his weakness, which were his technical abilities in governing, and I think that ultimately the government became dysfunctional, and I think that's a great pity. He had everything going for him as Prime Minister, but couldn't capitalise on that. I personally think that's a tragedy, but we are where we are, and we now need to take it forward, and we need to do now what is best in the interests of the country to make sure that we continue with a Conservative government and we avoid the absolute horror of a union-smashing socialist SNP coalition.
Liam Fox, it was a marathon interview. I owe you a pint at the Red Lion. Thank you for your time. There you go. There you go, Dr. Liam Fox there. And next up, we'll hear from the other side. Yes, right, we'll be speaking to Sir Christopher Chope, who is supporting Team Truss. Look forward to catching him in just 2 minutes.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
It's Mark Dolan in for the great Mark Steyn, and we are the People's Channel, so let's hear what the people have to say. We asked whether you rate either of the prime ministerial candidates. Deborah says, I would have much preferred Kemi, but I'm glad that Penny has been eliminated. I've got to say, I'm absolutely devastated that she didn't get a chance to face off against Rishi Sunak. A contest I think she would have won. Another viewer says, time will tell. Let's see what they have in their lockers. I think you're absolutely right. It's going to be a long race. A marathon, not a sprint. Tracy says, no, bring back Boris. Roddy says, Rishi will destroy the economy with his socialist economic plan and rising taxes for the poorest. There you go, socialist Rishi. Wow, damning words. And Carol says, neither are what the public voted for. Well, that's an issue I'll raise with my next guest. You are watching GB News on an historic day as the chair of the 1922 Committee of Backbench Tory MPs announced the final two candidates in the race to become Prime Minister. Here's how it happened.
The numbers of votes cast for each candidate is as follows. Mordaunt, 105. Sunak, 137. Truss, 113. Therefore, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss will be the candidates going forward to a final ballot of Conservative Party members.
So who will be our next PM? Let's get the views of another Conservative MP. They're like buses, these folks, aren't they? Joining us right now from Team Truss is Sir Christopher Chope. Sir Christopher, welcome to GB News. Why are you gunning for Liz Truss?
Well, I'm gunning for her because I think I would have wished that there hadn't been a vacancy, but there is a vacancy, and I think she's the best person to fill that vacancy. She's been a really good Foreign Secretary. I think her long, distinguished record in government shows that she's capable of addressing issues and actually resolving them. And that's been really her hallmark. So arguably, she was given the job of dealing with the Northern Ireland Protocol and expected to fail in that. But actually, she has delivered a piece of legislation which has now gone through the House of Commons, and that will be the means by which we will deliver the full Brexit, not just for the rest of the United Kingdom, but also for Northern Ireland as well.
However, she's a former Liberal Democrat supporter who voted Remain. She doesn't really stand for anything, does she?
On the contrary, I think she's got the enthusiasm of the convert and the zeal of the convert. I've always been a strong Conservative, and my views haven't changed. But there are people whom views do change, and I think that Liz was probably over-influenced by her socialist parents, but over a period of time, and particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, she's realised the virtues of not only leaving the European Union, but the virtues of having free markets and an open, competitive economy.
A majority of Conservative MPs have backed Rishi Sunak. So what do you know about Liz Truss that they don't?
Well, I think Rishi Sunak started his campaign a lot earlier than Liz Truss. Liz Truss has been a bit late off the starting gate because she was not expecting there to be a vacancy. But now you will see that throughout this election campaign within the Conservative Party, she has been the person who's been gathering momentum. And she, in this most recent vote, gained a lot more votes than Rishi Sunak gained. And there's a very small gap between them. So I don't think there's an issue there. I think the issue now is who's going to appeal to the wider Conservative electorate of members across the country.
I've said in my monologue earlier in the programme, Sir Christopher, that she's a highly experienced cabinet minister with 5 posts to her name. I think she'll make a decent prime minister, but she's not a great performer, is she? And that's going to be a factor in 2 years' time at the next election.
Well, I think the next election will be decided not on who performs well at that election, but what happens between now and then. And if we can get to grips with the economic problems we've got, if we can reduce taxes, if we can go back again to our commitment not to increase national insurance, which if we have Rishi Sunak, then that will be a complete disaster, because it will be a millstone round our neck at the next general election, because people will say, you promised not to increase national insurance and you have. Liz Truss is going to reduce national insurance to back where it was before. So that will help us. I think it's going to be issues which are going to decide the next election rather than personalities.
How can you not be persuaded by a candidate in Rishi Sunak that's willing to tell his electorate, this niche and rather sophisticated electorate, something they don't want to hear, which is that Britain cannot afford tax cuts?
Well, I have to say, Mark, that this is totally at odds with what Rishi told me and a group of Conservative MPs who went to see him at the time of this spring budget, because he told us that he was on our side in arguing for tax cuts and cuts in public expenditure, but that he was being held back because he didn't have the support which he wanted from other Conservative MPs and people in the government. So he was saying to us that he actually believed in lower taxes and lower public expenditure. Now he's saying it's a virtue not to have lower taxes and lower public expenditure. So I don't really understand what it's all about.
Sounds like Rishi Sunak flip-flops. It sounds like Liz Truss flip-flops. Why did we get rid of Boris Johnson in the first place? Bring back Boris, all is forgiven.
Well, that's a good point to make. I mean, I said at the time that we'd rue the day. I hope we don't have to rue the day. And I think that Liz Truss presents the best opportunity of not ruining that day. But I think it's Boris Johnson will be revered for what he has achieved for our country. And I think the way in which he was forced out of office is absolutely wrong. And actually, Liz Truss, of the two candidates remaining, was the one who remained loyal. The other one actually was instrumental in his downfall.
That ultimately do for Rishi Sunak, because we know that many Brexiteers on the right of the party are focused on keeping Rishi Sunak out of number 10 at all costs.
Well, I think there's that aspect of it, which may affect some people, but I'm more worried about the policy side of it, because I think that I think it was Jacob Rees-Mogg who was reported as saying that we just lost a socialist chancellor. Well, and Sunak's people have tried to accuse Liz Truss of being a socialist. But I think that we can't have high taxes and high public spending and increasing borrowing. Those are the hallmarks of a socialist rather than a conservative. But I think there's also another issue here, and that is that at the next general election, we're going to be up against a Labour Party whose leader will make a lot of the fact that Rishi Sunak was fined for breaching COVID laws. If I'd be Rishi Sunak, I would have appealed against that, because I think that it was pretty thin gruel. But he didn't appeal against it, and I think that will be there, and he can't argue against it, and I'm afraid that will be used against him at the next election.
Do you think Liz Truss could potentially be even more of a Brexiteer Prime Minister than Rishi Sunak?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, as I say, she's a more recent convert, but she has shown in the way she's dealt with the Northern Ireland issue that she's determined to solve this intractable problem. And she spent a lot of time patiently trying to negotiate with the European Union on this. And then she discovered that really they weren't interested in negotiating. And so she's called their bluff and said, well, we've got to get on with it. And she's brought forward legislation which has now gone through the House of Commons. If it gets held up in the House of Lords, then ultimately it could be the subject of a Parliament Act, and this time next year, and so we could get it in place. But that's a backstop. In the meantime, I hope, and I'm sure she does, that the European Union will see the force of actually amending the current arrangements so that the problems in Northern Ireland can be resolved.
Do you shed a tear for Penny Mordaunt, who was eliminated today?
Well, I shed a tear for all my colleagues who put their head above the parapet and in this leadership race. I also shed a tear for Boris Johnson, frankly. But I think what this race has shown is that under Boris, a lot of talented people were given ministerial jobs. And I think we've seen in Suella, we've seen in Kemi, and probably in Penny as well, people who have got a great talent. And I hope that those talents are going to be utilised by the next Prime Minister.
Final thought, Sir Christopher. Which of these two candidates would be the least keen on locking the country down in the future on the occasion of an extra wave, a new wave of COVID or a new variant of COVID? One of the reasons why I'm minded to support Rishi Sunak is that the Mail on Sunday reported at the end of January that it was actually Chancellor Rishi Sunak, Lord Frost and Jacob Rees-Mogg who cornered the Prime Minister in December and talked him out of cancelling Christmas.
Well, I'm obviously not privy to all these discussions, but my understanding was, and I was voting against all the lockdowns after the first one, which I thought was justified on the basis of the threat to the NHS, but all subsequent ones I voted against and argued against. And I was told at the time that Liz Truss was actually very much on the side of those of us who thought we were going over the top in restricting people's freedom. So, Mark, I wouldn't buy into that. I think, actually, if you look at their records, I think Liz is probably more instinctively on the side of freedom rather than Rishi. But maybe there isn't that much to choose between them.
So how close is it, do you think, Sir Christopher? We will be presented with our next Prime Minister in September. Is it Liz Truss's to lose?
Well, I don't think anybody can say that. I think it's going to be a good contest, and at least there is going to be a contest. And I think the worst fear I had was that at this stage, one of the last two candidates will pull out and say, we're going to have a coronation. I'm glad that's not going to happen, and I think it's healthy for our democracy, healthy for the Conservative Party, that these two candidates will be tested across the country over the next few weeks.
Great to have you on the programme. Thank you very much for your time. Sir Christopher Chope, who is backing Liz Truss. What do you think? Let's get your views very shortly. GBviews at gbnews.uk. Coming up, have the eco-nutters been drinking the climate Kool-Aid? Are the recent days of good weather an opportunity for eco-extremists to leverage this argument that will change our economy and impact our quality of life? We'll discuss all of that. Did we overreact to the heat wave? We'll speak to Alexandra Marshall, live from Down Under. She's a Spectator journalist and crunching the numbers on just how bad, in inverted commas, the heat wave was in historic terms with Jamie Jenkins. See you in 2.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Your thoughts on who should be Britain's next Prime Minister in just a moment. But let's touch now on what many consider to have been a hysterical overreaction to a couple of days of good weather here in Britain. Mainstream news channels and, of course, large portions of the press replaced COVID hysteria with climate hysteria this week. But was it justified? Did we overreact to that new record temperature high of 40 degrees centigrade? Is it proof that the planet is indeed heating up, or has a pleasant couple of days been leveraged by eco-maniacs who seek to drastically change our way of life and bankrupt our economy? Crunching the numbers is former head of national statistics at the Office for National Statistics, Jamie Jenkins, who can hopefully put this week's weather into some perspective. Plus, we're also joined by the Spectator Australia online editor, Alexandra Marshall, who's live down under, where the government have signed up to host the COP29 summit in, wait for it, 2024. In her brilliant piece in this week's magazine, she said hosting COP is the prize no sane country wants to win. Welcome both. Jamie Jenkins, could you give us a historical perspective in terms of how bad the weather was or how overly hot it was earlier this week?
Yeah, good evening, Mark. So obviously we have seen all parts of the UK hit these record temperatures. It was kind of forecast. We've had that big kind of jet stream pushing the heat up from kind of southern Europe. And what we've got is basically the hottest July. But if you look at different months of the year, the hottest June actually was in 1976. So there's still a long way to go to kind of beat the hottest June. The hottest November, because obviously we're looking at 12 months of the year in terms of things, was 1938. So it does vary. But I think that the general trend, Mark, you know, I'm a numbers guy, that the general trend over the last kind of 100 years has been, over the last 20 years, we've started seeing kind of higher than average temperatures than what you've seen in the first 80 years of the last century. But what we don't really have, I suppose, Mark, when you're looking at this in the long term, is kind of what was the temperatures in the, you know, over hundreds and centuries ago. We don't have those. When we talk about breaking records, we're talking about records over the last couple of 100 years rather than the last couple of thousand years. But we are seeing the temperatures go up overall.
Are there parallels between how the media have reported rising temperatures with rising case numbers in terms of COVID, with many parts of the media keen to leverage a hot day for the climate change cause?
Well, I think so, Mark. So I live in Wales, and we had a story on the BBC Wales News about a month ago, actually. We had a hot day about a month ago, not as hot as what we've seen over the last couple of days. And they had the chief medical officer in Wales, Dr. Frank Atherton, talking about climate change being a bigger concern than COVID. And then they had a little piece on there as well, talking about kind of wildfires, which you've obviously seen across the news over the last 24 hours, wildfires that we saw last summer in Wales. But what they omitted in there was the fact that it was proven that these fires were caused by arson. So we don't know what's been causing the fires over the last 24 hours, but there does seem to be this kind of, as soon as you get these record temperatures, all these doomsayers come on, they put all these fires on. We don't know what the cause of them in the last 24 hours are, but as soon as it happens, it's all doom and gloom rather than some of the positives of all this better weather.
Is the summer of 1976 a worthy counterpoint to the narrative that Britain's on fire?
Well, the summer of 76 obviously was lower in terms of what we've got now. And some of the kind of the Met Office colleagues that are, you know, would say that we've got record numbers now, but the summer of 76 was a bit more prolonged than what we've got. Like temperatures have pretty much dipped back down to what you would expect for the time of year over the last 24 hours now. It's pretty cool out there. I think until you get those prolonged periods throughout the year as well, I think, you know, we need to treat a bit of caution. But as you've touched upon in the presentation tonight, Mark, as soon as you get these hot temperatures, you get everybody jumping on the climate change bandwagon. You know, there may be something in there, there may be something not, but it does seem to be that as soon as you get some hot temperatures, CO2 emissions, we've had Prince Charles coming out this week, preaching again this week, you know, we need to kind of take a step back and have some calm in all of this, I think.
Yes, and of course, Jamie, people choose the statistics that support their argument, which means if we have a cool August, the climate change fanatics will go very quiet.
No, they will go quiet. And obviously, I think the important thing here, Mark, is the world is kind of warming up, the people are saying, and it's all to do with CO2 emissions. And if you look across the world, China has gone from 5% of CO2 emissions back in kind of the 1970s now, or 1965 actually, up to about 30%. But China's got a huge population. Actually, when you look at it on a per head of population, the UK is relatively in line with what you would expect. We've got about 1% of the world's population, 1.1% of emissions. It's actually countries like Australia and the US where, when you look at the population and the emissions themselves, it's far, far worse. So you talked about, obviously, coming down to Australia. They've got kind of their own problem in terms of CO2 emissions to tackle. So obviously all this virtual signaling between Prince Charles and these different countries, we really do need to look at it on a per head basis. And actually, some countries think they're doing better, but they're not actually doing better at all.
Alexandra Marshall, a great piece in this week's Spectator Australia. Australia are to host the COP29 summit in 2024. Why aren't you celebrating?
Well, we haven't got it yet, but Albanese, our new Prime Minister, who has done nothing but jet around the world since he got elected, has been campaigning at the Pacific Islands Forum to try and get the role. And that's where we are now. There's nobody else really contesting COP29, so we're probably going to be stuck with it, which is an expensive waste of time. We're not celebrating because, as we all know, Glasgow was a laughingstock. It's all a lot of climate nonsense where all these people arrive in private jets and five-star accommodation, and they tell us that we can't have our farms and we can't drive our cars. It's a lot of nonsense. But what is really crucial, I mean, you touched on it just a second ago, it's carbon emissions that they're trying to cut around the world, but it's not per capita that matters, it's how many people a country is feeding. So Australia is feeding a lot of people around the world. So obviously we're going to have a larger per capita carbon emission because we're growing food for the world. We're also powering most of China, or about to start again. So that matters when we're talking about emissions. And that's never taken into account when these Pacific Islands forums tell us, oh, you can't have carbon emissions. It's like, well, do you want to eat Australian food? Do you want us to be able to give you power supply? These things matter.
Well, indeed, and perhaps we should excuse the high levels of carbon emissions coming from China, given the fact that it's China who are producing the goods that are hoovered up by the West.
Well, we saw what happens when you start trying to cut carbon emissions without thinking about what you're doing. You end up with Sri Lanka, where the whole economy collapses almost overnight and people start to starve. So these ideas that the UN has been putting out and that COP26 was putting out, they've been mostly theoretical until very recently, when some of these governments tried to start putting these net zero emissions into real practice. And they've been catastrophic almost immediately. And the last thing you want for the health of the planet is lots and lots of poor people, because they don't look after the planet because they don't have the time, because they're hungry and they're starving and they need to do things. So making the West poor and cutting off food supply is the worst possible idea you can do for the planet.
Briefly, Alexandra, where is public opinion at in Australia in regard to climate change?
Well, we've got a problem where our electricity grid is being replaced by renewable energy, which doesn't work very well and is extremely expensive. So as our cost of living goes up, Australians are becoming increasingly irate about our power bills climbing, which they are rapidly, and we've been teetering on the edge of blackouts. So as Australia, we have almost all the uranium, much of the coal, a lot of the gas, and yet we have no power and it's costing us a fortune. That shouldn't happen with a responsible government. It is purely politics, and Australians are increasingly waking up to what's happening to their power.
My thanks to Jamie Jenkins. Check out his brilliant Twitter handle, @StatsJamie, for all of the important information when it comes to COVID, climate and many other issues. He has crunched the numbers so you don't have to. Plus, my thanks to Spectator Australia online editor Alexandra Marshall. Well, lots more to come. A very, very busy few minutes before Dan Wootton at 9 o'clock for Dan Wootton tonight. Now, we asked you if you thought the heatwave had been overhyped in the media. Let's get your thoughts on this. Let's have a look. All flooding in on WhatsApp, you see, because I'm very down with the kids. And we have the following. So Charlie says, no, it's Matt. Is the Pope Catholic? This in terms of whether or not we've exaggerated the climate threat. Al says it obviously was over-egged. The question to answer is why? What's the agenda behind the hysteria? David says, I pay thousands to travel to somewhere with decent weather. Maybe the East Anglia coast will become the new Mediterranean. I love that bit, tongue-in-cheek. A few more on that. Robert says, climate emergency. What climate emergency? There you go. Fantastic stuff. Have we got time for Drill Dolan? I think we do. So let's have a look at your questions to me that I've not seen in advance, but they've just landed on my phone. How about this? Charlie says, Mark, I love your show, but today I disagreed with you as you keep supporting Rishi Sunak. He already bankrupted the country and he's a snake in the grass. I don't trust him. Well, look, Charlie, I understand that. I totally hear from perhaps the majority of GB News viewers that Rishi Sunak is about as popular as a fart in an elevator, but I just think he's a slick operator. I think he can defeat Keir Starmer. He can keep Keir Starmer out of number 10. He's organised, he's bright, he knows the Treasury inside out, he understands the economy. So I would say he's the lesser of two evils, but I'm not going to pour a bucket of brown stuff over Liz Truss, who I think would be a perfectly decent Prime Minister. I just worry that she might be Theresa May Mark II. Harrison, I guess he's the least worst. This is Rishi Sunak, in the sense that he presided over the biggest waste of taxpayer billions in the last 2 years and didn't bat an eyelid. Well, you see, this is the thing. He was executing Boris Johnson's policy. Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister when we indulged in the horrific experiment of lockdowns, which I believe has been a catastrophic disaster for the economy and for the society, and also for public health, with a waiting list of upwards of 12 million people on the NHS. All on Boris's watch. However, credit to Boris for getting Brexit done, the vaccine rollout, and, of course, pushing back against the worst excesses of SAGE. He was brilliant in the Commons today, and history will judge him kindly indeed. Dan Wootton is next. Cannot wait for Dan Wootton tonight, and I think Dan's there. Hey, Dan.
Mark Dolan, good evening to you. Oh, my goodness. I think we might have a row about the whole Sunak thing, to the support of Sunak. Do you know, actually, Mark, while you've been on air, Sunak has just released a behind-the-scenes video of his day today. And I'm going to play it at the top of the show, so do stand by, because, Mark, it is so cringeworthy. It is so awful. I actually feel, Mark, he's a bit like a droid political candidate. I don't feel anything is real about him. He's super slick. I think he's a globalist. I can't believe that the Tory members will vote him in. I just can't.
I just think Liz Truss is a weak candidate. I think she's a sort of the afterbirth of Margaret Thatcher, if you like. I think she's a lightweight, Dan. I don't think she's a great performer. We need someone that knows the economy, knows the Treasury inside out. I think it's Rishi, but that's the magic of GB News. It's all about opinions, and I cannot wait to hear yours. Dan Wootton tonight coming up. Don't miss a second. I'll see you tomorrow.
Good evening, Alex Deakin here with your latest weather update. After all the lively weather of the heat and then the thunderstorms, tomorrow is, well, pretty average actually. A lot of dry weather around, temperatures close to average as well, thanks to these cold fronts which are pushing away yesterday's extreme heat. But they have triggered 1 or 2 thunderstorms and still 1 or 2 rumbling on well into the evening across parts of eastern England. Hit and miss, but some torrential rain is possible. It could cause a bit of disruption. They're tending to fade as we go through the night. Certainly many western areas having a dry night and a relatively clear night across Wales, western Scotland, and a pretty comfortable night, certainly compared to earlier in the week. Temperatures, some towns and cities staying in the teens, but generally, as I said, a much more comfortable night. Temperatures tomorrow will be close to average, quite a lot of cloud around, and we will see maybe 1 or 2 showers over the Midlands, particularly late in the day, northwest England, maybe southwest Scotland. But for most places, it's going to be dry and bright, and we'll see some sunshine coming through West Wales, southwest England, northern Scotland. And temperatures close to average across the north, high teens, low 20s, further south maybe into the mid-20s. Still a few showers across parts of northern England during Thursday night and into Friday. And Friday will be a case of, again, seeing a few more showers breaking out. Again, hit and miss, so if you're desperate for rain, this isn't a guarantee that you're going to see any. But there is an increasing chance during Friday, spreading up from France, of seeing some thunderstorms breaking out Again, they'll be hit and miss, but again, where they do occur, they could cause some disruption with some heavy rain in a short space of time. Temperatures just picking up a little bit across the south, mid, even high 20s possible. Again, further north with a lot of cloud, we're mostly looking at high teens or low 20s. More mixed picture into the weekend. We are going to see some wet weather at times across the north, but in the south, signs we could tap into some warm conditions again this weekend.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.